I'm Patrick Murtaugh, and this is our first Pints and Politics Online. So we already got the beer going. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Three-Headed Eagle Alliance, we're a new organization. We recently formed to address two primary concerns, and we are educating voters about the Constitution of the United States of America as understood in the language at the time of its adoption, or as some people say, as written. And we're challenging our elected leaders to adhere and to uphold those principles and values. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Debbie as our programs director, and she'll explain a little further. Debbie, you're on?
Yep, I'm on. Thanks, Pat. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We've been looking forward to getting back to our in-person events and supporting our local restaurants. However, it's a great time to be supporting, to have family and friends that normally don't get to be here with us in Kane County. We wanted to let you know that Evan has graciously offered to sign some of his books. And if you're interested, I put my email and phone number in the contact, and you can get more in the chat section. And you can get more details if you're interested by contacting me later after our event. As Pat mentioned, if you would like to have any questions, just put them in the chat, and then Pat will read them off to Evan after Evan speaks. So I just wanted to give you a little introduction about who Evan is. I'm sure many of you already know who he is. He's considered one of the nation's leading political philosophers and activists. Andrew Breitbart called his lecture at the Heritage Foundation one of the 5 most important conservative speeches ever to be given, while Bill Whittle calls his previous book, The Kindergarten of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks, perhaps the most important book I've ever read in the past 10 years, adding, it has forever changed and clarified the way I see the world. Evan has also written 4 speeches for President Trump, including the infamous Al Smith dinner speech, While He Fights, is the single most read article in town hall's history. Evan's latest book, The Woke Supremacy, an anti-socialist manifesto, is receiving rave reviews from the likes of Dinesh D'Souza and Sebastian Gorka, and was called one of the most important books by our time by best-selling author Nick Adams. On behalf of the Three-Headed Eagle, it is my privilege to introduce to you Evan Sayet. Thanks, Evan.
Yay. Thanks, Debbie, and thanks everybody who's in attendance today. As you can figure out from what Debbie said in that very kind introduction, I work in any number of I know this is the wrong way to say it, but mediums. I work in various media, and so I've written several speeches for the president, and I've delivered speeches of my own. I've written articles for Town Hall and elsewhere. I've written a children's book on environmental hysteria. I've written my least favorite way to deliver my thoughts is via a book. Books are hard to write. You don't get the same kind of instant gratification that you do when you write an article. It gets published, and that day you get the response. And sometimes you put in weeks and weeks, months and months, even years and years to write a book, and it just doesn't hit with an audience, and it's much more heartbreaking if you tell a joke or write a sketch or write even a speech that doesn't necessarily work. So I didn't necessarily want to write this book. I didn't want to write any book at this point. But I was sitting home during the lockdown, and I was watching the riots break out in Portland and Seattle and elsewhere. And I was listening to the pundits and the politicians and even some of the participants, and none of them really seemed to know who the woke are. I mean, we use that expression all the time, the woke. But how many of us actually know what it means, where it came from, where they came from, what it is they want, what it is they're willing to do to get it? And most frighteningly, I was going to say disconcertingly, but that word isn't even strong enough. most chillingly, what is likely to befall humanity if somehow they were to win. And so, just as my original book, The Speech to the Heritage Foundation, that Andrew called one of the 5 most important conservative speeches ever given, which turned into a book called The Kindergarten of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks. And that was considered definitive in explaining the modern liberal mindset of about, gee whiz, 10, 15 years ago. But that mindset has hardened as time has progressed. It's hardened for a very simple reason to understand. In 10, 15 years, the last of the great generation's influence has waned as they've retired, as they've passed on. And those who embraced this ideology more and more came to power in the universities, in the entertainment industry, in Democratic Party politics, and in journalism. And so what was once a more benign uh, philosophy, ideology, has hardened into something quite terrifying. And that ideology, they themselves call themselves the woke. And that's what this book is about. It explains who the woke are, where they came from, what they want, what they're willing to do to get it, and what will befall humanity if they were to win. And I begin the book, The Woke Supremacy, by giving an overview of the past 100 years, because it was almost exactly 100 years ago that 3 things happened virtually simultaneously that set the course for the modern world as we know it. The first was World War I, which left the most advanced cultures of the world economically bankrupt and physically devastated. And it left them with a form of governance that was no longer seen as viable. Because these governments entered this foolish war and couldn't extricate themselves from it, no matter how much damage was being done and how much little was being accomplished, the fact that they got themselves into this war, couldn't get out of this war, and were left so devastated, the form of governance that had led to the great cultures of the world was no longer seen as viable. Just at that moment, 2 new systems of governance burst upon the world stage. One was socialism. With the Russian Revolution, Marx's theory of socialism was put into practice for the very first time, almost exactly 100 years ago. At the same time, America arrived on the world stage as an influence and as a power, and we brought a system of governance that I call modern nationalism. And these 2 systems of governments have been at war. They've been fighting for control of the globe for the past 100 years. In fact, every one of the wars that we entered over the past 100 years, save for post-socialism, post the Soviet Union, has been to stop the further spread of the socialist system, whether it was Hitler's National Socialists, whether it was Lenin and Stalin's Soviet socialism, whether it was in Korea where we sought to stop the spread of Chinese socialism, or Vietnam where, again, it was the Soviet socialist expansion we sought to halt. Nationalism, our system of governance, has been at war against the socialist system of governance for the past 100 years. Well, with the defeat of the National Socialists, the German Socialists in World War II, and the collapse of the Soviet Socialist Union in 1991, it was generally recognized that socialism was, as Ronald Reagan said it should be, on the ash heap of history. Right? Famed political philosopher Francis Fukuyama called it, in fact, the end of history, in that man's long search for the best form of governance had finally been found, with America's nationalist system that had brought peace and prosperity and progress and liberalism, lowercase l, and opportunity and the demise of disease and poverty and hunger, having won out over the horrors of the socialist system. Well, socialism is back, and it's once again at war against nationalism in general and America in particular. And so I wrote this book because I do believe this war is going to get bloodier. I do believe that, given the fact that there is no appeasing socialism, there is no deal to be made with socialists. Socialists do not have any good intentions other than to create the utopian world, the perfect world of their imagination. And so I start the book by explaining that there's a difference between the mistake people make when they think of socialism is to think of it as an ideology. Right? It's not. It's a organizing mechanism, a global organizing mechanism, and an economic structure that has been employed by any number of ideologies through the years, right? Marxism wasn't Leninism, wasn't Stalinism, wasn't Maoism, wasn't Pol Potism, wasn't Hitlerism, and it's not Bernie Sandersism. The ism, the ideology has changed. And we make a mistake when we think of socialism as an ideology because we then accuse the other side of things that aren't true about them. We can see the similarities between Nazism and wokeism. But those similarities are more systemic than they are ideological. In fact, in the book, The Woke Supremacist, I stipulate that democratic socialism is the polar opposite of Nazism. Right? That should not be as reassuring as it sounds. For one thing, ideology has very little to do with behavior once the system has been embraced. Once you buy into the socialist system of a government owning all possessions and the government being global, it almost doesn't matter what the ideology is. So even though the ideology is the polar opposite of Hitlerism, for example, Hitlerism was about hate. So the democratic socialists are going to be about love. Nazis were uniformed and regimented, so the democratic socialists were going to let it all hang out and do their own thing. You know, the Nazis walked in lockstep and goose step, so they were going to walk to the beat of their own drums. They really envisioned this as the antidote to Nazism and other supremacist ideologies. The problem is, again, ideology has very little to do with behavior once the system has been embraced. Further, polar opposites tend to have more in common with each other than they do with things that are more towards the middle. Right? The North Pole and the South Pole are quite literally polar opposites. And yet because they have more in common than they do with the things that are more towards the middle and more towards the equator. Finally, because the democratic socialist believes himself to be the opposite of Hitler, he shares with Hitler a sense of supremacism. After all, if Hitler was the worst person to have ever lived, then they must be the best people to have ever lived. Right? A belief that is not supported by evidence, by their behaviors. But nonetheless, it gives them, in their minds at least, the moral rightness to do some pretty dastardly things, because anything that they do against us is something they believe is anti-Hitlerism. This is why they call us Hitler all the time. It's not that we actually have anything in common with Hitler, but because they are the antithesis of Hitler, anything that doesn't walk in lockstep with them is at least a degree closer to Hitlerism than they are. So I point out, first of all, you're not supposed to compare anybody or anything to Hitler. The problem with that is when people say never again, it is predicated on the recognition that it can happen again. So the idea that in some way Hitler was a one-off or a fluke or a freak that shall never be repeated, that's belied even by those on the left, especially in the Jewish community, who would say never again. So you have to recognize to invoke Hitler cynically and gratuitously, and simply in the way that the other side does it about us, is immoral. But to not point out the similarities when there are similarities is to betray those for whom we say never again and for whom we mourn today because it did happen. So what are the similarities between Nazism and democratic socialism? Well, let's start with the fact. Let me do it this way. Instead of talking about the worst person to have ever lived, the worst socialist, Hitler or Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot, let's talk about the nicest socialist to have ever lived. It's a guy named John Lennon. And Lennon, by the way, was not a socialist. The protagonist of that song was a socialist. But nonetheless, in that lovely tune because we always think of Hitlerism as the vicious vitriol and the hateful language that riled the people. Well, in this lovely tune, John Lennon lays out the three perquisites for the perfect world according to any socialist, whether it was Karl Marx, whether it was Mao, whether it was Hitler, whether it was Ocasio-Cortez. They are that there be no personal possessions, no countries, and no religions. Once those three things have been accomplished, then the perfect world of their imagination can then manifest itself. What that perfect world was differed in the minds of Hitler. The utopia that Hitler envisioned was a different paradise than the workers' paradise that Marx imagined, or Lenin, Lenin, imagined. And it's different still than the perfect world the democratic socialist imagines. But nonetheless, they all envision creating the perfect world of their imagination once those three perquisites have been met. Well, the problem with no possessions, no countries, and no religions is that with no possessions, the individual does not have the resources to stand up to an oppressive government. Without countries, there are no other nations strong enough to stand up to an oppressive globalist leader. And without religions, without God, there's no higher moral mandate to countermand the orders of the globalist leader, no matter how egregious and immoral those commands may be. So without possessions, without countries, and without religion, there is nothing to stand in the way of the authoritarianism and totalitarianism that socialism, even the nicest form, even if the world of their imagination is a world of peace and love and justice and beauty, there is nothing to stand in the way of the excesses of this globalist regime. Guys, I got to know, am I making sense to you? Normally I'd be looking into your eyes, and is this all working?
No, it's excellent.
It's wonderful.
We're really enjoying it. In fact, I was in a band in the 80s with my high school friends, and we played that song several times. And looking back, I think how foolish I was. I had no
And there's a good reason for it. I mean, there's a reason that Lennon's 3-minute ditty is so beloved by so many good and decent people. You know, when Gal Gadot and all the folks in Hollywood, I don't know if you saw the video of all of them during the pandemic singing Imagine from their various homes and bathrooms and elsewhere. The reason that Lennon's 3-minute ditty is so attractive to good and decent people is because it's only a 3-minute ditty, he didn't have time to explain how he intended to get the world from here to there. Right? And even Marx, in the perfect socialist system, even when it was just theory, before human beings got involved with our own shortcomings, even in its perfect theory, Lenin knew that in order to get from here to the workers' paradise, there would first have to be a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. And their job was to do the nasty and violent things required to rid the world of all the people who didn't fit into their paradigm. Just like Hitler had to wipe out all the people. You know, one of the lines from the song, as you'll know, Patrick, is
Right.
Imagine all the people living as one.
right.
Well, Hitler imagined the world living as one. It was just a different one. Stalin imagined the world living as one. It was just a different one. The people who sing and embrace the song imagine the world living as one, just like they did. The only difference is who is the one? Who are the one? What's the special trait that this one has? The one, according to Hitler, were the Aryans. The one, according to Marx, were the proletariat. The one, according to the democratic socialists, are the woke.
Right.
And it's very simple to recognize, because in order for all the people to live as one, all of the others have to in some way be dealt with. All of the people who believe in the rights to the fruits of their own labor, for example, possessions. All of those who believe in the protections that national sovereignties bring, countries. And all the people who believe in the moral codes that various religions bring. They all have to in some way be dealt with. And the reason Lenin's 3-minute ditty is so attractive is because he leaves out the how are they going to deal with us part. He goes right from imagine where we are now to imagine how the world would be if the rest of us weren't here. If those of us who believe in the rights to the fruits of our own labors, the protections of national sovereignties, and the moral codes that various religions bring us. So while we don't yet know how the democratic socialist intends to rid the world of all the others, what we do know is how the others who embrace socialism went about doing it. Uh, the Russians went with gulags and permanent confinement to mental institutions and exile to frozen tundra. The Germans try always more efficient than everybody else went with gas chambers and ovens. The Chinese seeking to lower their infrastructure costs and material costs went with mass starvation.
Right. And you had, oh, to interrupt, you had Larry Granthal was embedded in with Bill Ayers in the Weather Underground, and they planned to kill 25 million Americans.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the Weather Underground plays a huge role in my book because they are actually the founders, not the Weather Underground specifically, but the 60s radicals in general play a huge part because they were the founding fathers of wokeism, of democratic socialism. I mean, I'll jump onto that if you like. What happened was in the 1960s, a handful of truly bad people. We think back to the 60s and we think to the hippies and the Summer of Love and Woodstock. Well, that wasn't the radicals. That was the hippie movement that actually had very little to do with the radicals. The radicals were vile, sick people, truly with mental illnesses. And they were violent and they were murderers. Bernardine Dorn was a terrorist. The Weather Underground was a terrorist organization. Give you an idea how vile these people were. And this is in the book. At the very first meeting of the Weather Underground in 1969 in Flint, Michigan, they took a moment to cheer Charles Manson. And the reason was because both they enjoyed the bloodthirstiness. They were a bloodthirsty movement, just like they are today. You look on the streets, they're killing the cops. They're beating up people at restaurants in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. They always were a bloodthirsty movement and led by people with a mental illness. But also because they shared with Manson his plan for bringing about a revolution. And the plan was to start a massive race war. That's what Helter Skelter meant, was an apocalyptic race war. And that was something that the Democratic Socialists attempted to do from the very beginning and continue to do today. This is why they lie about Michael Brown and what happened in Ferguson, Missouri.
Oh, that was
And this is
horrible.
why they lie about what happened with Trayvon Martin in I forget the name of the city, but in Florida. This is why they constantly lie about. This is why they only cover killings that have a white shooter, and they don't care at all about black on black crime or black on black murder. It is wholly intended to start a race war because their hope is to divide and then conquer. And this was true. One of the big lies about the 60s radicals was that they were part of the movement for equal rights in America, especially the civil rights movement. But they did not want equal rights in America. They were against them from day one, which is why when they arrived and they had the choice of joining the party of abolition, the party of women's suffrage, the party of the 1957, which back then was recent, civil rights bill, the Civil Rights Act signed by Eisenhower, when they had the choice of joining the party of equal rights, they instead joined the party that was on the opposite side of every one of these things. This is why they became Democrats, not Republicans. It's simply a truism that people join the party that is closest to their own beliefs and which is most likely to help them accomplish their personal goals. Well, the party that was closer to their own beliefs was the party of George Wallace. It was the party of segregation. It was the party and by the way, every civil rights stain on America, from slavery to the Indian Removal Act, which was by the Democrats, to the Japanese internment, which was by the Democrats, to segregation in Jim Crow, which was the Democrats. And so there's a reason they joined that party. Further, when the civil rights movement broke into two groups, there was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who sought equal rights, and he sought equal rights by calling upon our nationalism. The nationalism being that every citizen in the nation has equal rights. It broke into two groups, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Malcolm X was very much like the Democratic Party of today. Martin Luther King's movement, whatever he might have mused about socialism, his movement was a Republican, and I will say uppercase R, like us, movement. It was Judeo-Christian in spirit. It was peaceful in action. And it was pro-American, and it was nationalist. It was based on equal rights. Malcolm X movement was exactly the opposite. It's like the Democratic Party of today. It was Muslim in spirit, violent in action, anti-American in objective, and Malcolm X was a black nationalist. The modifier black had to be inserted because they had to modify the meaning of nationalism. Just like today, in order to insult us, they can't call us what we are. We're nationalists. Right? The nationalist believes that the world, with its 8 billion people, its 7,200 languages, its 4,200 religions, plus a whole host of further complicating factors like varying climates and topographies and weather and natural resources. The world is simply too complex for the kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all global governance that socialism seeks. But the nationalist believes that the best way, the most efficient, effective, just, moral, progressing, the best way to organize a government is through city-states, where local leaders with local knowledge, firsthand knowledge of local issues, makes policy in the best interest of the local citizens.
I'd like to ask one thing about this is demonstrated in the masks. One size fits all. Everybody
Right.
wear masks, whether you.
That's right. And all of the policy that says there's no difference, like you look at a state as wide as big as California, for example, and there's no difference whatsoever between how they treat people who live in Los Angeles and people in Modesto or outside. I mean, one size fits all policy requires one of three things. Everybody must be made into the same size. Anybody who complains about ill-fitting policy must be silenced. And anyone who complains too loudly or too effectively must be dealt with, must be canceled. You know, and by the way, I'm jumping around quite a bit this evening. I hope, again, that's why I keep asking if everybody's with me.
No one will give you any trouble, Evan. You're doing fine.
All right. And this is without a pint, because I can. It's only 4:30 or 5 o'clock where I am.
But it's 5 o'clock here. It's after 5 here.
I got to tell you, since the pandemic started, my new slogan is it's 9 a.m. somewhere. But you know, we look back at the atrocities committed by the other socialists that came before the current crop, and we say to ourselves, well, those must be associated with the ideology, not the system of socialism. And therefore, because the new socialists are so nice, their ideology is so nice, they would never commit such atrocities. Well, those atrocities, gulags and death camps and killing fields, they're not ideologically driven. Who is sent to them is. Right? Gulags and gas chambers and killing fields were simply the more primitive versions, the more primitive technologies of what today we call a cancel culture. Nazi Germany was a cancel culture. If you didn't agree with them, they canceled you. All right, the China and Mao was a cancel culture. The only difference is the advance in technology. And this is exactly what George Orwell warned about in the book 1984. And Orwell's genius was not found in his recognition of socialism's, in his case, English socialism or INGSOC, socialism's inherent traits of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Everybody was well aware of that. Again, it was written into the Marxist manifesto. Right? Authoritarianism and totalitarianism were required via the dictatorship of the proletariat until all the others were dealt with, and then paradise would reign. And Orwell's genius was found in his prescience in recognizing that it would be technology that would become the new gulags and gas chambers, a less bloody, a less horrific, a less ghastly means, but the purpose is exactly the same: to cancel our voices, to undermine our ability to get in the way of their vision of utopia. Once again, what that vision is very different under democratic socialism than it was under Nazism, Maoism, Hitler, Stalinism, etc. But it's irrelevant because A, that's only in their imagination, and B, there's still the dirty work of having to get from here to there. Yep. In order for all the people to live as one, whether the one is the one that Hitler envisioned, the one that Marx envisioned, the one that Pol Pot envisioned, they all envisioned the world living as one. But to get the world to that place where they all live as one, even before we discuss if that one truly is the best, they still need to commit the atrocities that every single socialist system, every single socialist entity has ever that has ever existed has employed. It's simply a requirement. In order for all the people to live as one, all of the others have to in some way be dealt with. All right, so who is the one? Yes, sir. I see you have a question, maybe, Patrick.
Well, I wonder if you want to keep going, or if, there's only 26 of us here. If people want to ask questions, type something in the chat and
Patrick,
yeah.
I am on lockdown. Where am I going to go? All right.
Well, I'm curious. Is this, the pandemic, the COVID? That's just the start of trying to eliminate, so you speak, the ones that don't fit.
Oh, no doubt about it, and to condition us for following the rules and for seeing government supersede what the Constitution allows. Look at the powers that we've given governors. Look at the powers that we've given to control where and when and we worship and who we worship with, where and what we can do, control our businesses, control our incomes, control our travel. I have no doubt that the pandemic is real. I have great doubt that it's anywhere near as deadly and contagious and horrific as they portray it to be. And I have no doubt that we should be advised by the CDC and others on how best to act, but I don't believe that they should be dictating how best to act. And of course, as always, you have people who aren't affected by their own decisions. One thing that you always have in a socialist system is a two-tiered system. You have what I call the master planners, and then there's everybody else who is greatly impoverished. And that's what they're doing to us, is they're taking our middle class and greatly impoverishing them via these rules. But meanwhile, they still go and get their hair done. They still go to the French Laundry. They still go to all these places. So you have this two tiers that just didn't really exist in America prior to what's going on right now.
Exactly. This is something my dad was in World War II. He was supposed to go to Normandy, but he got sick and went to the infirmary instead. And his company shipped out without him, and all but 4 of them were killed on that beach.
Right.
And he remembered that how big that was, and they made him an MP. So I guess his company was gone, so they didn't know where to put him. And I read about what the MPs did, and it was every dirty job. but he was a driver and he would either take high value prisoners or generals or whatever around. And so he learned a lot about what happened there. And
Well, and that's huge because one of the reason that the '60s radicals failed in inciting their revolution was that they couldn't find anybody who had lived in the real world. People like your dad, who, from the last of the great generations, who had fled socialism under Nazism or fled socialism under Stalinism, or who had gone overseas to fight socialism, who had any interest whatsoever in the imaginary world of these people whose system was exactly that brought all the horrors that your dad and my dad and others saw. And so when they couldn't get, and by the way, it's a great story in my book. Uh, this is the kind of attitude that they were facing when they were seeking recruits for their revolution. And by the way, they made no bones about the fact that they were seeking revolution. They made no bones about the fact. In fact, Bernadine Dorn, the wife of William Ayres and one of the founders of the Weather Underground terrorist group, she approached a bank of microphones and she said, "Hi, I'm Bernadine Dorn, and I'm going to read to you a declaration of war." Said they declared war, they engaged in acts of war, they worked in ways that were in every way from propaganda to sabotage, acts of war, and nothing really changed. But what they were facing when they sought to recruit people to join them were people like Muhammad Ali, the great boxer.
right,
And Muhammad Ali went over to Africa to
right,
to to,
yeah,
to fight in Zaire. And
right.
so, to be supportive of his ancestry and the Black continent, he set up his training camp over there and spent weeks and weeks in Africa. And when he came home, the reporters asked him, and remember, this is a black man from the then still segregated, still Democratic Party controlled South, who had by then already long ago converted to Islam. So you're talking about a black Muslim man. And they said to him, "Muhammad, what did you think of Africa?" And Muhammad Ali said, quote, "Thank God my granddaddy got on that boat."
Tell you recount his name, Cassius Clay, for us, and then I want to open up the mic for Rich. Rich Hayhurst has a question, and there's just a few of us, so people can ask their questions. I think.
But actually, I'd rather just finish the
Okay.
reason I told that story. That's which is when the terrorists and the murderers who wanted to bring socialism to America failed to get any following, they sort of went underground and they went on what's called the long march through the institutions. Right? They took over the schools, sometimes at gunpoint, like at Columbia University,
Right.
sometimes through natural attrition as the last of the great generations moved on. They took over power, sometimes via the kind of purges that we see in socialist environments. But they took over education and academia. They took over the entertainment industry, and they took over the news fields. So they turned academia into their ministry of indoctrination. They turned news and entertainment into their ministry of propaganda. Now they have their ministry of social communications, and they used those institutions, to brainwash successive generations into their ideology. You know, it was Mark Rudd, just another one of the despicable bloodthirsty people who founded democratic socialism. It was Mark Rudd who said the true founding of the '60s will come in the '90s when we've taken over the institutions. Well,
Wow.
he was wrong only because he missed the obvious. Once they'd taken over the institutions, they then needed to use them to brainwash successive generations into believing their nonsense. Well, if 30 years is from the '60s to the '90s, what's 30 years from the '90s?
The
2020.
20.
Right, 2020, which is why you're finally seeing them take off the masks, showing their fangs, finally, once again, admitting that they are socialists. Once again, the rhetoric of murdering cops, of terrorizing us on the streets. You know, this seems to have come so quickly and so out of nowhere, but it hasn't been. They've been waiting for their social justice warriors to make it through the institutions, to be brainwashed in the way that Hitler had his Hitler Youth and the way that Lenin had the young pioneers. These people on the streets now have gone through, and just like, by the way, the Islamic supremacists have their madrasas.
Right.
These are people who have been steeped in the narratives and the orthodoxies of the woke from the time they're a child. They've been deprived of any alternative point of view because they cancel us as soon as we speak. And now they are as brainwashed and incapable of questioning the indoctrination as were the Nazis on the streets. One more quick story, if I may. But Hannah Arendt, who is a famed a political philosopher from the 50s and 60s, she was sent by the New York Times to cover the Adolf Eichmann trial in Israel. And what she wrote was the most disturbing part of it all was the normalcy of Eichmann. You know, and she produced a line that has become quite famous. She called it the banality of evil. We make a mistake when we look at our friends and our neighbors who are siding with the other side, but they're so nice. They're not Nazis. They're nice people. They're really,
Right.
in any supremacy, in any such movement, it's only about 10% who really believe in the supremacy. They were in the Old South. The Ku Klux Klan was only about 10% of the population. In Germany in the 30s and 40s, only about 10% were actually members of the Nazi Party. Well, only about 10% of the people in this movement actually know and understand and believe the supremacist ideology of wokeism. But the rest have been so steeped in and so denied any alternative to the narratives and orthodoxies that they don't even ask a single question. They simply buy into these things. And you know what, Patrick, I'm going to keep going because this is actually good for me.
Well, this reminds me of the 45 communist goals that were read into the Library of Congress in 1963. It's exactly what Yuri Bezmenov talked about.
Yep.
And it's Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals.
He's all over my book as well. It's hard. It's impossible to write about these people without talking about Saul Alinsky. But I just wanted to give an example because, again, it's always so easy to point to the monsters and the obvious ones. I want to point to another one of the nicest people, and I'm actually a huge fan of this guy. It's so heartbreaking to me that he's always on the wrong side of everything. But I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan. Right? And Bruce Springsteen has a song called Born in the USA, and where he describes the reason for the Vietnam War. And the line is, got in a little hometown jam, so they put a rifle in my hand, sent me off to a foreign land to go and kill the yellow man. In other words, the Vietnam War was because Americans are racist. I mean, we are such an evil and horrible peoples that we ourselves would go, or we would send our children halfway across the world to a godforsaken jungle in order to kill people because they had different color skin than we do. If that were true, then truly we are an horrific people. But the problem is the truth is exactly the opposite. And what's most disturbing about that is that Springsteen had to have known it, or at least he had to have possessed the knowledge and the acumen to have figured it out had he given it even a moment's thought.
Right.
Because while it's true that the North Vietnamese who we were fighting had yellow skin, so too did the people of South Vietnam.
Right.
If the people we are fighting with and for also have yellow skin, then the reason for the war could not possibly be the color of the people's skin. And thus, it's not really the evil, horrible people who know wokeism who are the biggest threats to us. It's those good and decent people who have been so steeped in the narratives that they don't even give it a moment's thought.
So the natural question is, how do we begin to unravel that spider web of deceit?
Yeah, it's awfully hard because it's almost like deprogramming the brainwashed or people in a cult. In fact, in my earlier book, I don't know the name of my book, the
Garden of Eden.
kindergarten, how the modern
I've
brain
been
thinks.
calling it the kindergarten of evil.
Everybody does. Don't feel bad. Everybody for some reason does. But how do you go about? Oh, I call it in that book the cult of indiscriminateness.
Right.
And and
The moral
how do you
imperative.
go about it? You know what? At this point, this war has to be fought on every single level, just like a real war. So what one thing, if they came to Eisenhower, if they came to FDR, and FDR said, well, what's the one thing we have to do to win this war? They would have laughed in his face. We got battles, we got years ahead, we got carnage to come, unfortunately. But on two different fronts, there's the micro and the macro. I'm going to give you first the micro, which is how to deal with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, your family members. And I have a program I call Adopt a Democrat.
Oh, it sounds painful.
It can be painful, but it can be joyous too, just like raising a child, which is why I call it Adopt a Democrat, because in reality, they are children. And that's why my original book was called The Kindergarten of Eden.
Right.
Because they actually, if you want to know what it is they seek to do, they seek to so reverse humanity. A reset is what they now call it. But they want to return us to the Garden of Eden or the kindergarten classroom. And I give example after example after example in the new book, but one of them being one of the most famous and iconic songs of the woke supremacist era was a song called Woodstock. And in Woodstock, Crosby, Stills, Nash, I think Young was with him as well. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young sang the original purpose of wokeism. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons that they called themselves the counter culture. Their purpose is to counter culture. Culture is the manifestations of the human intellect, usually meant through art and science.
Right.
But their goal was to counter culture. And if you look around at the things they attempt to do, it is always designed to tear down the beautiful, tear down the sublime, tear down the accomplished, tear down the things that have led to where mankind is today, because they truly do want to return us to the kindergarten of Eden.
So
And,
that
and
strikes me as some of the things I've always suggested is we have to keep doing those things that reinforce our culture. I'm in the Knights of Columbus, and a lot of people lost hope and dropped out. And I encourage everybody, don't stop doing those things. You have to continue building up those organizations that have made us a society that cares and is generous and charitable.
Well, all the above. I mean, we got here for a reason. And by the way, there's something I find interesting. While the left always offers paradise, utopia, where we're going to end poverty, we're going to have everybody's going to have state-of-the-art health care. They promise perfection. We've never promised perfection, and we never thought ourselves as people capable of delivering utopia. When President Trump says "Make America Great Again," he doesn't say "Make America Perfect."
Right.
Our founding fathers spoke about a more perfect union, implying that we weren't
There you
perfect.
go, Chad.
Gotcha. Yeah, so
Good
adopt a
timing, man.
Democrat, and I call it adopt a Democrat because they really are children, morally, intellectually, in every conceivable way. And by the way, they are proud of the fact that they are children. For example, there was a book written that became a cult classic that sold millions and millions of copies. It was dubbed Sublime in a review by the Washington Post. It was called Brilliant in a review in the New York Times. And the book was called All I Ever Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten.
Yeah.
Good book. Not a lot of people know this, but the subtitle of Hillary Clinton's book of philosophy, It Takes a Village, is, and other lessons children teach us. If you look at the perfect people back in the 60s, they were called the children of the 60s and flower children. And by the way, the enemy of the children was called the man. And this is where they seek paradise. They seek paradise because the Nazis committed the most egregious crimes of discrimination, the most egregious acts of discrimination. So what makes the modern liberal, the woke, supreme is that they are not going to discriminate at all. They do not discriminate between good and bad, right and wrong, truth and fiction. Did I leave out beautiful and ugly? All things, all people, all familial constructs, all forms of government, all works of art, all things are to be deemed equally good and equally right. Well, indiscriminateness is the thinking of the 5-year-old child. In fact, what Robert Fulghum, the author of All I Ever Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, learned in kindergarten were the rules of indiscriminateness. Don't hit anyone. Everyone must be invited to your birthday party. Every child must get a turn, which is why the socialist economic structure, every child must get a cookie, but no child may ever have two, works for them today just as it did in kindergarten, because it's the it's the ideology of the naive and of the ignorant. And just to put a capstone on this, this is why one of the only 3 slogans Big Brother pasted all over Oceania was that ignorance is strength.
Right. Right.
I don't have my chat box. It disappeared for so. If people have questions,
you can maybe talk about the example of the roulette wheel I read was very interesting.
well, that's actually for the previous book.
Yeah.
And I couldn't remember the name of it. You think I'm going to remember that story? But I'll give it my best shot.
Okay.
All right. When you are indiscriminate, when nothing is better than anything else, then success is unjust. Why should a person, a culture, a religion, a familial construct, an athlete, why should something succeed if it's not better than anything else? Right? Conversely, but for the same reason, failure, as proved by nothing other than the fact that it has failed, is proof positive that somehow the failure has been victimized. After all, why should a person, a religion, a country, a nation, a team, why should something fail if it's not worse than anything else? Right? And if success and failure is unjust, by extension, great success and great failure is a great injustice. And exceptional, long and sustained success and long and sustained failure is the greatest proof of the greatest injustices that could possibly be. This is why they hate America and they hate Israel. It's not because these two nations are the worst nations, so they commit the most egregious crimes. It's not because they're the most sexist or racist or homophobic or xenophobic, quite the opposite. The reason that they hate America first and Israel second is because America is the longest surviving and most successful democracy or democratic republic or self-governing peoples in all of human history, and by far. And Israel and the Jews are the longest surviving culture in all of human history, who, no matter the time for the past 3,500 years, no matter the oppression, the gulags, the pogroms, the holocausts, always tended to survive and thrive and fight above their weight in cultural matters, arts and entertainment, in science, in medicine, in literature, in music, in everything. Look at the state of Israel with its symphony orchestras and how many Nobel Prize winning physicists come out of this tiny nation of, I believe it's now maybe 8 million people. Well, if there's nothing special about America, because they're not allowed to believe anything special, that would end, if they believed something was special, that's the end of their being part of that movement. If there's nothing special about America, then how do you explain America's success? Well, there's only two explanations. Either there is something good and exceptional about America, which, by the way, could be emulated by others, and when and where it has been, it has led to their success. Or there is nothing special about America, which then proves that our exceptional success, our exceptional prosperity, or exceptional strength must somehow have been gotten through criminal means. And they don't even have to know what those means are. And the roulette story is, imagine sitting at a roulette table and somebody else wins. Well, that's not fair, but it's not unfair. That's just the way the game is. There's luck in everything. But now let's say that same number and that same person comes up 10 times in a row. Well, you might not still be able to prove injustice, but it's a cosmic injustice. It's not fair, and you might even hear some of the losers say, point over at the stack and say, "You didn't build that. Well, give me some of it. It's not fair that you have that and I have nothing." But now let's say the same people played the same number and it came up 1,000 times in a row. Well, you don't have to know how the cheating was accomplished. It's simply a given that cheating took place. And that's how the Democratic Socialist is with America. They don't need to actually argue and prove that we are this egregious cheaters. It's simply a given as proved by our success, by our long and sustained success. Because the only other option is that success was earned, which is something that those who are indiscriminate, who cannot discriminate, it's something they simply cannot believe. And they're just not allowed to. They wouldn't be a member of this movement if they could believe it.
Right.
Did I do that justice?
When I was in the band, I used to have to remember about 72 songs, and so I had a lot of crib notes for that. And I think you did a fantastic job.
That last time I get told that story is maybe certainly more than half a decade ago. So thanks. Yes.
I think Rich had a question. Rich, is Rich's mic on?
Yeah, I think everybody's mic is open. Is it open?
Rich, did you want to ask your question?
For us. He's over there.
What?
There he is.
It was actually my question, and total agreement with everything that you said. I was just wondering, you were saying one of the solutions, actually, an answer is to how do we go back from here? How do we make Orwell fiction again? Because moving towards the Orwellian, type. But how do we start to go back? We have a lot of conservative have kids who have been indoctrinated. I'm thankful that my kids are not too deeply in, but many have them, and they so much so that Christmas and Thanksgiving this past year and this year are going to be difficult because they are so indoctrinated. Actually, come from their own parents.
Yeah. Okay. Forgive me. Let me stop you there because I know you have you want to go on, but let's just start with the one thing I did offer but didn't get all the way through, which is adopt a Democrat.
Right.
One of the reasons I call it adopt a Democrat is because one of the mistakes that we make is we are so right and they are so wrong, and we think that they're adults, and if we only lay out the facts for them, they're suddenly going to change. And so we debate them and we argue with them and we get angry. And if you did that with a small child, they would eventually rebel. We don't need to make everything a teachable moment. And it might take, like raising a child, it might take 18 years, all right, to expect to win them over at Thanksgiving and have them finally see the light is counterproductive. What you've got to do is point out a couple of times along the way when they do something or they embrace something totally egregious. It's like when your child runs into the street, that's when you spank them. You don't spank them over every little thing, and but if they say something like, and this is an example from years ago, I need to update it, but I can't believe that guy made that video that got our ambassador killed in Benghazi. That you have to just sit and not accept. but let them win little points, just like you'd let your little child beat the front door. You don't have to prove that you're the fastest, you're the best, you're better. Point out little things along the way, and what invariably happens is something happens in their own life that will open their eyes. I think about my cousin a lot because he's the sweetest guy. He's smart. He's none of the things that we always think of, evil and stupid and whatnot. And it dawned on me, he wasn't in Benghazi, so he doesn't know what happened there. So he has to trust the 5 minutes of the nightly news that he happens to catch. And he wasn't in Mexico, so he doesn't know what happened with Fast and Furious. And so he has to trust the media but then he got in the mail that his insurance policy had been canceled, and that if he wanted it, his premiums were going to skyrocket. And suddenly the lie of Obamacare hit home. And it wasn't because he's selfish and didn't care, and suddenly now that it's bothering his life, but now he held in his hands the truth. And he didn't need the filter of the media. And perhaps at that point, he goes back in his head and thinks about the seeds planted over time. So in the micro, the one-on-one, we have to stop treating them as if we're in a college debate and that we have to win it before the buzzer goes off. It's going to be a long-term project, but you know what? I have switched so many people in this fashion and never once anybody by grinding my teeth and yelling at them or turning my back on them or any of the above. The other part of it, that's the micro, that's the one-on-one. The macro, I'm not capable of giving you a lot of encouragement that this is going to be accomplished peacefully. I believe that we need to stop pretending that we're dealing with our loyal opposition or our good-meaning colleagues. These are people who have proved, if you go all the way back to the beginning to William Ayers and his terrorist ways, but even just go to how they were willing to lie about a good man, Brett Kavanaugh, and invent sexual assault in order to keep him off the Supreme Court. Look at how they are willing to turn their backs as Antifa burns down cities and beats people up. Look how they're willing to steal an election. These are not people with whom we can any longer deal as if they are the loyal opposition. And we have to recognize that we are, in fact, at war. And it's an existential war. And it's a continuation of the war that began 100 years ago. It's a war between the globalist socialists who seek a system like Hitler's, seek a system like Mao's, who seek a system like, and the nationalist system that America introduced to the world 100 years ago.
That it's I call that the Dan Bongino protocol. I don't know if you've heard Dan Bongino talk about it, but that's his assertion also.
Indeed, and I don't look. The unfortunate reality is, no matter what, evil has an advantage over good, because good is constrained by its goodness. There are things that good won't do because we're good. Evil is constrained by nothing. And this gives evil an advantage at every turn. And it's exactly why Saul Alinsky made one of the rules for radicals: make the other side live up to their book of rules. And unfortunately, in war, you can't live up to your book of rules. You have to recognize that these are extreme things. And if we do live up to our book of rules, if we continue, for example, if we simply hand over the presidency now, because according to the book of rules, that's how it goes, well, then the left is about to close out their revolution.
Right.
And they've already weaponized the government against the people.
Right.
Whether it was the IRS against Tea Party and conservatives, whether it was the FBI against their political opponents, whether it's imprisoning innocent people for the sake of intimidation. The only reason they didn't go further was because they were sure that Hillary was going to win. And they would have 8 years why make the frogs jump by doing it too quickly? Well, they're not going to make that mistake again. And so they are going to close out this revolution and do it quickly. And so we first need to recognize that we are at war with these people. They are not our co-ideologists. They are not our fellow patriots. It's the same war, and with the same outcome. If the socialists had won the Cold War, or if the socialists had won World War II, exactly what happened when the socialists did win in Vietnam, the horrors that were visited upon the South Vietnamese. It may be more technologically advanced and therefore less bloody, but the end game of silencing and disempowering all of the others, they're already well on their way to it. And that needs to be recognized. What can we do? I need to be careful about calling for certain actions publicly, but I do believe we need to start. I do think we need to start recognizing that a lot of people on the left, a lot of people who supported Hitler, a lot of people who supported Mao, Stalin, etc., weren't true believers, but they did the cost-benefit calculus. What's the cost of opposing them, and what's the benefit of siding with them? And in America, the benefit of siding with them is you get late night television shows, and you get book deals, and you get tenure at the university. And the cost of not siding with them is you get beat up on the streets, you get fired from your jobs, you get hassled, your children get hassled. And so they've done the cost benefit equation, and they side with the left. Well, we need to alter that cost benefit equation. We need to do anything and everything, and it's not one action, and it's not going to be tomorrow. One thing I'd like to see us blockade David Geffen's yacht. Just make it. Let's cut off the electricity to Bruce Springsteen's studio. Let's do things that a resistance and an underground would do, and let's see how willing they are to continue to lie about us when it doesn't come only with benefits and no costs. So I don't have all of the answers as to what we can do. But what we have to do is increase the cost and lower the benefit of being a member of this supremacist movement.
Yeah,
I
Rich just interjected that the march in DC, the attendees started to fight back. So we're already seeing a little of that happen.
Indeed. And how many of you saw my speech at not this one, but the one just before it?
You send me that link. I watched it.
I shall. I spoke in front of 500,000 people, and today 26. So in the last 2 weeks, I have spoken in front of 500,026 people.
We are honored that you came to our little boutique here, and you can return anytime, and I'll put these guys together. Maybe we'll have 28 or 30 next time.
Well, actually, what I hope is that next time it's in person.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Super exciting, for sure. That would be awesome.
All right, so kids, I do have another, at 6 o'clock my time, I've got another media hit. But here's what I want from you guys. Please do buy my books, read my books. But also, if when you read them, you believe that they're as good as I believe they are, please spread the word, because I'm shadow banned on Facebook. I've been completely kicked off of Twitter. And so word of mouth is everything. So if you read it, buy it, read it, and then tell people, please.
Well, we appreciate it, Evan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was awesome. And thank you, everyone.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you. And if you would like to get involved and become a three-headed eagle or a member, please contact me. Like I said, in the chat box is my information. Pat's information was on the original email that was sent out. And we'd like to, as we have those three-headed eagles, we'd like to wish all of you Merry Christmas and a terrific New Year. And please join us in helping us to continue educate voters and challenge leaders. Thanks so much, everyone. Oh, Pat, in the chat box. Look in the chat box is my information.
Just wait, we'll give it a couple minutes.
It's I can tell you 630-712-2141. call me
Sounds like-
and then we can talk about it.
Horses galloping.
Okay?
I don't, do you,
Yeah, it was in there.
I'm trying to,
630-712-2141.
Now,
Nancy, I think you have my phone number anyway.
I do. I'll text you.
Okay,
if
perfect.
you'd like, I'll
Thanks for hosting
take the
this.
recording off here. And then if anybody wants to stay on, and I'll open up all the mics, and let's see if you guys want to keep talking and drinking. So I know where there's more beer. So
let's stay.